Okay.
Just want to say hello to all. Glad to be here. Looking forward to everything you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob.
Okay. So here we have the ground rules. Please review them briefly. Aquí en la pantalla pueden ver las reglas para esta junta. Por favor, léelas brevemente. And for now, I will begin with the land acknowledgement from we typically use this in the UC Santa Cruz, and it goes: the land on which we gather in the extended territory of the Awaswas speaking UP tribe, the Ama-Mutsun tribal land, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission, Santa Cruz, and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. La tierra en la que nos reunimos es el territorio no cedido de la tribu Yipi de habla Awaswas, la banda tribal Ama-Mutsun, compuesta por descendientes indígenas llevados a las misiones de Santa Cruz y San Juan Bautista durante la colonización española de Costa Central. Hoy trabaja arduamente para restaurar las prácticas tradicionales de administraciones en estas tierras y sanar el trauma histórico. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to the chair, Dr. Raminder Suri. Con eso les presento a el presidente del panel, Dr. Raminder Suri. Raminder, you are on mute.
Well, double thank you, Azucena. And on behalf of the panel, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our audience. I would like to also welcome the members of the independent review panel who are joining us this evening.
Gracias. En nombre del panel quiero dar una muy cordial bienvenida a nuestra audiencia. También me gustaría dar la bienvenida a los miembros del panel de revisión independiente que se unen con nosotros esta noche.
The panel members are Philip Berge,
Los miembros del panel son Philip Berge,
Robert Glennon, Sharon Kenney, Julie Lockwood, Adina Payton, and Robert Roger. I also want to acknowledge the hard work of our wonderful support team at University of California, Santa Cruz, and the consulting firm Kennedy Jenks. They made substantial contributions and were very helpful.
El doctor Siri acaba de nombrar los miembros del panel que están ahorita en esta llamada. También quiere reconocer el fuerte trabajo de nuestro maravilloso equipo de apoyo en la Universidad de California, Santa Cruz, y la firma consultora Kennedy Jenks. Ellos hicieron contribuciones sustanciales y fueron muy útiles.
Just to recap our journey briefly, as you may know, the state gave a contract to UC Santa Cruz to set up an independent panel with a support team to review the 11 concepts that the state had received regarding water importation to restore the Salton Sea. The principal investigator of UC Santa Cruz contract is Professor Brent Haddad.
Para resumir, a lo mejor ya saben, pero el estado de California otorgó un contrato con la Universidad de California Santa Cruz para establecer un panel independiente con un equipo de apoyo para revisar los 11 conceptos que el estado había recibido con respecto a la importación de agua para restaurar el Salton Sea. El investigador principal del contrato de la Universidad de Santa Cruz es el profesor Brent Haddad.
Last fall, the panel invited entities to update their submissions. And also if any entity wanted to submit new concepts. We ended up with 18 submissions. We also invited submission companies to make a presentation to the panel.
El otoño pasado, el panel invitó a las entidades a actualizar sus presentaciones y también si alguna entidad deseaba presentar nuevos conceptos. Recibimos 18 conceptos. También invitamos a las empresas que nos entregaron conceptos a que hicieran una presentación de sus ideas ante el panel.
When we last met in April, our panel had completed our first review, screening the 18 ideas to import water to restore the Salton Sea. Of those original 18, 13 concepts proceeded to the fatal flaw analysis, which is the topic of this meeting.
Cuando nos reunimos por última vez en abril, nuestro panel había completado su primera revisión, evaluando las 18 ideas para importar agua para restaurar el Salton Sea. De esos 18 originales, 13 procedieron al análisis de fallas fatales, que es el tema de esta reunión.
So the purpose of the fatal flaw analysis is just as it sounds, to identify which, if any, of the remaining 13 approaches can deliver imported water to the Salton Sea and have long-term sustainability. Each approach was examined for any fatal flaws.
El propósito del análisis de fallas fatales es tal como suena, identificar cuál de los 13 enfoques restantes, si alguno, puede entregar agua importada al Salton Sea y tener sostenibilidad a largo plazo. Cada enfoque fue examinado en busca de fallas fatales.
After a careful investigation, we have identified 3 submissions that do not have any fatal flaws. This evening, we will tell you more about these 3 approaches, how we arrived at our conclusions, what our findings mean for the region, and what is next for the panel.
Después de una cuidadosa investigación, hemos identificado 3 conceptos que no tienen fallas fatales. Esta noche les contaremos más sobre estos 3 enfoques, cómo llegamos a nuestras conclusiones, qué significan nuestros hallazgos para la región y qué son los siguientes pasos para el panel.
Our fatal flaw report has been published, and it is available at the website you see in the chat box. I would like to say that our panel unanimously endorses our fatal flaw report.
Nuestro informe de fallas fatales ha sido publicado y está disponible en sitio web. Puede ver aquí en la pantalla que están ahí los enlaces de las 2 páginas en donde existe el reporte.
To get into the details, let me return the floor to our project coordinator, Azucena Beltran, and our project principal investigator, Professor Brent Haddad. They will provide you with a brief overview of the fatal flaw report, after which we will turn to any questions from the public. Thank you.
El doctor Suri también había dicho que en el panel por unanimidad respalda el informe de las fallas fatales. Ahora dice que para entrar en detalles quiere devolverle la palabra a Susana Beltrán, o sea, yo, y el investigador principal, Brent Haddad. Ellos les brindarán una breve descripción general del informe de fallas fatales, luego de lo cual pasaremos a las preguntas del público. And with that, thank you, Dr. Suri. And we're going to enter a dialogue between Brent and I, and these questions are just a series of questions we thought would be the most asked or popular questions in the meeting. And with that, we will begin. Le dije, me disculpé con el doctor Suri y vamos a entrar a una serie de diálogo de preguntas entre Brent Haddad y yo. Estas son una serie de preguntas que nosotros pensamos serían las más populares o más preguntadas en esta junta. So Professor Haddad, turning to the most recent report, please tell us about the submissions that passed the fatal flaw analysis.
Well, thank you, Azucena, and greetings, everyone. It's great to see you all again. And as Chair Rominder Suri said, 3 submissions have passed the fatal flaw review. Importing water to restore the Salton Sea is an extremely difficult task, yet 3 groups who made submissions identified ways to do so that have no fatal flaws.
Le acabo de preguntar al profesor Haddad que nos cuente sobre los conceptos que pasaron en el análisis de fallas fatales. Él nos dice que gracias y un saludo a todos. Y también dice que se aprobaron 3 conceptos de importar agua para restaurar el Salton Sea. Es una tarea muy difícil. Sin embargo, 3 grupos que entregaron sus conceptos identificaron formas de hacerlo sin tener fallas fatales. Antes de continuar con... you may proceed, Brent.
So I'll share with you some slides, but before I do, I just want to mention that many of our panelists live on the East Coast. And in fact, one of them is currently on the other side of the world from us. And so I hope we will forgive them if they leave a little bit early, just because it's 3 hours later on the East Coast. And I want to thank all of them for attending this meeting with us today.
Brent, el profesor Brent Haddad iba a continuar con el mapa. Quisiera mencionar que la mayoría de los panelistas están ubicados en la costa este, donde está 3 horas más tarde. Aprecia mucho que estén presentes, pero si necesitan salirse de la llamada, espero que todos lo entendamos.
All right, let me share my screen again. And so 3 of the submissions had no fatal flaws. They met all our criteria. And I'd like to describe their, basically show you in this map what the submitters came up with.
Entonces, 3 conceptos pasaron las fallas fatales y con este mapa les va a demostrar cuáles son las diferencias y similitudes.
So all 3 draw water from the northeastern side of the Sea of Cortez and deliver it to the Salton Sea. They avoid protected wetlands and the biosphere reserve. They use trusted technologies, and they are likely to receive the necessary permits and permissions.
You can finish the answer, Brent, and I can collectively translate after that.
Sure. Okay, I'll say a little more about them. The concepts meet minimum requirements for salinity, for ecosystem restoration, and for reduction in playa exposure.
Los 3 conceptos extraen agua del lado norte-este del Mar de Cortés y entregan Salton Sea, evitan los humedales protegidos y la reserva de la biosfera, usan tecnologías confiables y es probable que reciban los permisos necesarios. Los conceptos cumplen con los requisitos mínimos de salinidad para la restauración del ecosistema y para la reducción de la exposición de la playa. So, Brent, which submissions did the panel evaluate? ¿Cuáles conceptos evaluó el panel?
So here are the slides with the 13 submissions that moved beyond the first screening report.
Aquí nos enseña la página donde salen los 13 conceptos que pasaron en la primera evaluación.
And here are the three that passed the fatal flaw report or fatal flaw analysis.
Y estos son los tres que pasaron el análisis de fallas fatales. Brent, what are the fatal flaws and how did the panel arrive at them? ¿Cuáles son las fallas fatales y cómo llegó a ellas el panel?
First, let me say in general what the panel considers to be a fatal flaw. It is either a performance outcome that falls short of the goals of Salton Sea restoration, or it is a performance outcome that, while successful at the Salton Sea, has so many other negative impacts that on balance, it shouldn't be pursued.
Primero, Brian quiere decir en general lo que el panel considera una falla fatal es un resultado de desempeño que no alcanza los objetivos de la restauración del Salton Sea, o es un resultado de desempeño que, si bien es exitoso en el Salton Sea, tiene tantos otros impactos negativos que en general no debe perseguirse.
So the panel, just one more thing about this. The panel chose these criteria through a combination of guidance from the state, the panel discussions, panel research, community outreach, and the panel's expert knowledge.
El panel eligió estos criterios a través de una combinación de orientación del Estado, discusiones, investigación, alcance comunitario y su conocimiento experto. Brent, can you tell us more about criterion 1, which reads the submission is technically sound and utilizes established non-speculative technologies? Why are emerging technologies not being considered?
So let me say we'll just
Puede dar
stay.
información sobre el criterio 1, que es el concepto es técnicamente sólido y utiliza tecnología establecida y no especulativa. ¿Por qué no se están considerando las tecnologías emergentes?
So we'll stay on this slide for a while because we think it's important to go through all 5 fatal flaw criteria. So let's talk about number 1. The panel understands that creative, big thinking is needed to solve the region's water problems. However, the panel is also looking for reliable technologies, and then those reliable technologies can be deployed in novel ways. If a technology has no track record, then it is too risky for this project.
El panel entiende que se necesita un gran pensamiento creativo para resolver los problemas de agua de la región. Sin embargo, el panel está buscando tecnologías confiables implementadas de formas novedosas. Si una tecnología no tiene antecedentes, entonces es demasiado arriesgada para este proyecto. Okay, now moving on to criterion 2, which says the submission would not create significant risk of catastrophic flooding. Can you explain this further to us? El criterio número 2 dice que el concepto no crea un riesgo significativo de inundaciones catastróficas. ¿Puede explicarlo más a fondo, por favor?
This is very simple. The Salton Sea is well below sea level. The panel will not endorse any approach that carries the risk of accidentally flooding the entire region up to sea level. That would be a fatal flaw. The panel, in addition to looking at the basin itself, it looked at potential flooding outside of the basin along the water transportation routes.
Esto es muy simple. La cuenca del mar del Salton Sea está por debajo del nivel del mar. El panel no respaldará ningún enfoque que conlleve el riesgo de inundar accidentalmente toda la región hasta el nivel del mar. Eso sería un defecto fatal. El panel también analizó el potencial de inundación fuera de la cuenca a lo largo de las rutas de transporte de agua. Criterion number 3 says the submission is consistent with the objectives of the Salton Sea Restoration Act. This criterion has 2 parts, the exposed playa and the salinity. Can Can you explain how the panel decided the saline target of 70,000 milligrams per liter? El criterio atrás dice que el concepto es coherente con los objetivos de la ley de restauración de Salton. Sí, este criterio tiene dos partes, la playa expuesta y la salinidad. ¿Puede explicar cómo decidió el panel el objetivo de salinidad de 70,000 miligramos por litro?
This may seem high, meaning really salty, but recall that the panel is defining a limit for a fatal flaw. 70,000 milligrams per liter salinity is the point at which in-sea food webs supporting migratory birds collapses. And the highest, and it's also the highest salinity that the endangered pupfish can tolerate. It is the saltiest a restored sea could be, in the panel's opinion. There is a difference between ideal salinity, which is much lower, and a fatally flawed approach. And the panel felt that 70,000 milligrams per liter was the fatal flaw tipping point.
Esto puede parecer alto, lo que significa que es muy salado, pero recuerde que el panel define un límite para un defecto fatal. La salinidad de 70,000 miligramos por litro es el punto en el que colapsan las redes alimenticias en el mar que sostienen a las aves migratorias y la salinidad más alta que puede tolerar el cachorrito en peligro de extinción. En opinión del panel, es lo más salado que podría ser un mar restaurado. Hay una diferencia entre la salinidad ideal, que es mucho más baja, y un enfoque fatalmente defectuoso, y el panel consideró que 70,000 miligramos por litro era el punto de inflexión fatal. And what about the exposed playa? ¿Qué tal la playa expuesta?
So notice there's a 3A and a 3B. So now we did 3B first. Now we're doing 3A. So the panel took 2018 as the starting point and said that regardless of the eventual sea level, any playa that remains exposed in excess of the 2018 exposure levels should be either covered with water or otherwise remediated if left exposed. However, because the state has committed already to remediating 30,000 acres through its 10-year plan, the panel took that into account and credited all of the submissions with an additional 30,000 acres of remediated playa. But any approach that resulted in additional unremediated playa would be considered fatally flawed.
Quiero que reconozcan que estamos en 3A y 3B. Acabamos de repasar 3B, que habla sobre la salinidad, y ahora vamos sobre 3A, que es la playa expuesta. Quisiera pedir mis disculpas de que el equipo no pudo traducir 3A y 3B. Fue un error que nos sale en la pantalla. Mis disculpas. Ahora con lo que acaba de explicarnos el profesor Brent Haddad, el panel tomó el 2018 como punto de partida y dijo que independiente de la eventual evaluación de Salton, cualquier playa que permanezca expuesta por encima de los niveles de exposición de 2018 debe cubrirse con agua o remediarse de otra manera si queda expuesta. Sin embargo, el Estado ya se ha comprometido a remediar 30,000 acres en su plan de 10 años y el PAN tomó eso en cuenta en sus revisiones. Pero cualquier enfoque que resulte en una playa adicional sin remediar se considera fatalmente defectuoso. Criteria number 4 says no extraction or infrastructure being proposed will cause significant ecological impacts to the Basin Reserve and runs or wetlands of international importance located within the upper Gulf of California and lower Colorado River Delta. Why did the panel make this a fatal flaw? El criterio 4 dice que no se permitirá la extracción o infraestructura que se proponga causará impactos ecológicos en la reserva de la biosfera y los humedales Ramsar de importancia internacional ubicados en el Alto Golfo de California y el Bajo Delta del Río Colorado, porque el panel hizo de esto un defecto fatal.
These are internationally recognized regions with important and rare ecological conditions. The panel considered harming them to build or operate an importation project to be a fatal flaw. In addition to the principle of not harming globally recognized ecological zones, the difficulty of permitting such projects was considered to be too high for in the panel's opinion.
Estas regiones son reconocidas internacionalmente con condiciones ecológicas importantes y muy raras. El panel consideró que dañarlos para construir o operar un proyecto era un defecto fatal. Además del principio de no dañar las zonas ecológicas mundialmente reconocidas, la dificultad de permitir este tipo de proyectos se consideró demasiado alta para el panel. Brent, by any chance, did the panel contact the Mexican officials to come to this conclusion? ¿Se comunicó el panel con oficiales mexicanos para llegar a esta conclusión?
No, this was the panel's expert opinion on the wetlands and the biosphere. I should note that the panel has an expert on U.S.-Mexico water relations as a consultant on the support team. And this person, Peter Silva, was consulted on a number of important transboundary issues.
Profesor Haddad nos dice que no, que esta es la opinión experta del panel. Quería señalar que el panel tiene un experto en relaciones hídricas entre Estados Unidos y México como consultor en el equipo de apoyo. Y esta persona, Peter Silva, fue consultado sobre una serie de temas importantes. And criterion number 5 reads that the submission must be viable through 2078. Can you explain the sub-criteria under this and why was 2078 chosen? El criterio número 5 dice que el concepto debe ser viable hasta 2078. ¿Nos puede explicar qué subcriterios está bajo este criterio y por qué se eligió el año 2078?
The panel is charged with taking a long-term view. It doesn't expect any solution to simply end in 2078, but it needed a cutoff point for its analyses. 2078 makes sense because it is the long-term date mentioned in the quantification settlement agreement. And now let's, well, why don't you go ahead and translate that, and then we'll look at the 4 sub-issues.
El panel está encargado de adoptar una visión a largo plazo y no espera ninguna solución termine simplemente en el 2078, pero necesita un punto de corte para su análisis. 2078 tiene sentido porque es la fecha a largo plazo mencionado en el acuerdo de cuantificación. Estos son los 4 temas que el panel estudió para viabilidad a largo plazo y ahorita las va a mencionar el profesor Haddad.
So here, this criterion of must be viable for the long term had 4 sub-criteria, and you can see them now. We were looking at, is the water source reliable through 2078? Can the necessary water rights, property rights, access rights, and other rights and permits be acquired and extended through 2078? Can the engineered systems and the geological support systems be reasonably maintained or replaced through 2078? And does implementing the project create secondary effects such that the harms outweigh the benefits?
Los 4 subcriterios en criterio 5 los voy a mencionar ahorita. El número 1 es la fuente de agua, ¿es confiable hasta el 2078 o no? El número 2 es si se pueden adquirir para el proyecto los derechos de agua, derechos de propiedad, derechos de acceso y otros derechos necesarios como permisos y que sean prolongados hasta el 2078. El número 3 es que si se puede mantener o reemplazar razonablemente los sistemas de ingeniería, o sea, las pipas y todo eso, sobre soporte geológico hasta el 2078. Y el cuarto es la implementación del proyecto crea efectos secundarios de modo que el daño supera los beneficios, sí o no. Brent, Did the submitters know about these fatal flaw criteria before they submitted their ideas? ¿Los equipos sabían acerca de estos criterios de fallas fatales antes de enviar sus ideas?
No, they didn't. The panel was formed after the first RFI, request for information call happened. So the submitters were generating their importation ideas, not knowing exactly how they would be judged.
Profesor Haddad nos dice que no, que los equipos no sabían. El panel se formó después de que se ocurriera la primera llamada de ideas, entonces los equipos generaban sus ideas de importación sin saber exactamente cómo serían juzgados.
Because of this, after the panel had applied the fatal flaw criteria, each respondent or submitter was contacted with the details on what the criteria were and why their submissions had failed. And the respondents were then invited to provide resubmissions addressing their flaws.
Debido a esto, después de que el panel había aplicado sus criterios de fallas fatales, se contactó todos los equipos con detalles sobre cuáles eran los criterios y por qué su concepto fracasó. Luego se invitó a los equipos a que proporcionaran materiales adicionales que abordaran estos defectos. Brent, why didn't any Pacific Ocean projects pass? ¿Por qué no se aprobó ningún proyecto del Océano Pacífico?
So 3 submissions presented approaches that would have drawn water from the California coastline. None of them passed the fatal flaw analysis. And the panel believes that the existing regulatory requirements for large projects with an intake or discharge from the Pacific Ocean will not be permitted. It might be viable in the future if the state pursues regulatory reforms that makes it easier to build coastal infrastructure, but not right now.
El profesor Haddad nos dice que 3 conceptos presentaron enfoques que habían extraído agua del Pacífico. Ninguna de ellos pasó el análisis de fallas fatales. El panel cree que no se permitirán los permisos y requisitos para poder hacer esa extracción de agua. Podría ser viable en el futuro si el Estado persigue reformas regulatorias, cambian sus reglas y restricciones, pero por ahorita no. Professor Haddad, what happens to the concepts that didn't pass? ¿Qué sucede con los conceptos que no aprobaron?
The panel was impressed by the creativity and hard work that went into all the concepts. They are examining the ideas that did not pass for parts that are not fatally flawed and could be pulled into a composite importation concept. But overall, the ideas that were found to have fatal flaws will not be analyzed further by the panel.
El panel quedó como impresionado por la creatividad y el arduo trabajo que se realizó con todos los conceptos. Ellos están haciendo sus ideas que no pasarán por partes que no tienen fallas fatales y podrían incorporarse a un concepto de importación compuesto. Pero en general, las ideas que se encontraron que tenían fallas fatales no serán analizadas más por el panel. And then what would happen to the concepts that did pass? ¿Qué sucede con los conceptos que sí se aprobaron?
The next step is a detailed feasibility study of the concepts that have passed through the fatal flaw analysis that were not fatally flawed. And this study will look at costs, benefits, and expected timeline of implementation.
El siguiente paso es un estudio de factibilidad y es detallado de los conceptos que no tenían fallas fatales. Este estudio analizará las cosas, los beneficios y el cronograma esperado de implementación. Then what authority does the panel have over decision making about the future of the Salton Sea? ¿Qué autoridad tiene el panel sobre las decisiones que tomarán el futuro del Salton Sea?
The panel's end product is a recommendation to the state on the feasibility of importation approaches to restore the Salton Sea. The panel itself has no authority over what will be done with its recommendation. That's up to the state.
El panel no tiene ni una autoridad sobre qué se decidirá y qué no. Simplemente el resumen, el reporte resumido será una recomendación al Estado, pero es últimamente la decisión del Estado qué es lo que va a pasar. And then what would be next for the panel after this?
So let me share my screen again. The panel has 2 more reports coming up. In August, the feasibility study will be published, which we talked about. And in September, the summary report. After that, the panel will dissolve. Why don't you go ahead and translate that?
Aquí el profesor Hadar nos está enseñando lo que sigue para el panel. Ahorita realizó el análisis de fallas fatales y en agosto sigue el análisis de factibilidad.
And this shows the same thing in a more confusing way. And so thank you, Azucena, for asking those questions. And now that we've had a brief introduction, why don't we turn to Q&A and note that we are limiting questions to 2 minutes, not counting the translation. And I also noticed, and I haven't had a chance to view yet, that there are 34 comments. And if there are questions in the comments, we'll try to find them. But let's stop the share, and Sylvie, your hand is up, and so why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Okay. I want to salute and wish good luck to the people passing the fatal flaw phase. And my congratulations are really honest, because although I'm out, a big pipeline bringing water from the ocean to Salton Sea or surroundings would be a good thing for transoceanic freshwater project for the Western USA. So I have a please make it big, okay? I have a few remarks, okay? First, transoceanic proposed freshwater imports at an affordable cost for the whole Western USA, while the selected projects import salt water. I doubt that there would be any final project approved to dumping salt water near one of the best land in the USA, like Imperial Valley or Palm Springs area, when you have the possibility of freshwater imports. And please tell us if the freshwater is worse than salt water. But anyhow, let's go on. The brine is proposed for storage in a segment of Salt Lake or Salton Lake initially. I don't know if now in the final report it's still there. Salinity will increase dramatically, okay, and we'll have a new Death Sea in America. Injecting the brine into the ground is risky too for the ground water in the area, as well as transporting it back and dumping it into the Mexican Sea. Mexico will prefer the freshwater imports and transportation, although if the Americans want to buy salt water for a good price, they might be willing to sell it with a smile too, okay? I'm also a little sad that the panel did not really evaluate transoceanic solution in detail and consider it a speculative technology when the concrete ships are more than 100 years old and the USA is a prime technological power. Just a little sad and not more, because transoceanic was eliminated just by avoidance rather than by technical aspects. Okay, and here my question is, why trying to avoid this project when there was no technical flaw found there? It was just general. It is too interesting for us. Okay.
Okay, that's 2 minutes. And thank you so much for that question, which I will now ask Azucena to try to summarize.
El resumen de lo que acaba de decir Silvi, él entregó un concepto que se llama transoceánico al panel y él felicitó a los demás que sí pasaron y piensa que la región tiene potencial para importación de agua y está en apoyo de la importación de agua y está preguntando solamente de cómo fue evaluado su proyecto.
So, thanks for the question. And I want to focus on one key part of what you asked, and it was a major theme. And that was what happens to the salt that gets imported into the Salton Sea Basin along with the water. And because there is a salt balance problem. And so I can tell you that the panel is taking that question of salt very seriously, and in fact would consider it one of the most important questions in thinking about long-term solutions. So that's I'll stop there.
Profesor Haddad acaba de explicar de que su mayor problema que allá sirviera la salinidad en el Salton Sea, pero el profesor está asegurándole que el panel se está mirando sobre los problemas de salinidad que puede traer al Salton Sea válido a la importación de agua.
So Nathan is next, but Nathan, before we take your question, there is a chat question that I'd like to address, and then Nathan, you're next. It's from Cheryl Hamlin, and she asks, does the expert panel assume that lithium mining and the Salton Sea ecosystem can coexist?
Están preguntando en el chat que si la extracción de litio y la restauración de Salton sí puede coexistir.
And so in the fatal flaw analysis, there was nothing specifically related to lithium. But the panel is well aware of the discussions going on in the basin and the potential for an expansion of lithium mining, and is taking that into consideration as it looks in more detail at the importation possibilities.
En el reporte de las fallas fatales no se habla sobre la extracción de litio, pero el profesor Haddad está diciendo que el panel se ha fijado en las diferentes cosas que trae la extracción de litio y será una de las cosas que podrán ser mencionadas después, pero no están en el reporte.
Thanks. And Nathan, you're up.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate the review committee's work here so far. I did have a few that needed a little bit of clarification because they were touched earlier. The review committee did release the original RFI information, but they re-released it with an opportunity to include some of the judging criteria. And that was in August of 2021 or 2022, I believe. So the review committee re-released the RFI information and did ask for additional information requested of all the projects, but did not include the fatal flaw judging criteria, allow projects to understand what they were going to be judged on. So that is my main question I'd like clarity on. In a follow-up to that, during the fatal flaw review process, the criteria wasn't released when we received comments back about flaw, but I think proponents and other people asked for the judging criteria, and then it was released a few days later. But it wasn't released initially with the information requested. So we were kind of shooting in the dark a little bit, but really specifically about the 2-week time period to address some of these very large issues. The main question that I want to address around that is, if there is one or more fatal flaws that can still be resolved, is there not an opportunity for proponents to still resolve those issues during the time frame until the final report is or after? Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Nathan tenía como más o menos 3 preguntas, y una era de por qué las fallas fatales no fueron incluidas en la llamada para conceptos que hicimos en agosto del 2021. La otra sería que sobre el periodo que se les dio de 2 semanas para poder entregar materiales adicionales sobre donde están relacionando su falla fatal, y está preguntando si tal vez después de esto se podrá volver a abrir ese diálogo de meter materiales adicionales resolviendo las fallas fatales.
So thanks, Nathan, for those questions. And so the first RFI, which stands for Request for Information, that was issued by the state in 2017 with a due date in early 2018. And then the panel, well, UC Santa Cruz didn't reach an agreement until 2021 to help form the panel and carry out the review. And as a very first step, issued a new request for information and actually got some really interesting new ideas as a result. But even at the time of the release of the second RFI, which was right at the beginning of the panel procedures, the panel still had not settled on fatal flaws. And so nobody learned in advance what the fatal flaws were. And so, so that, why don't you go ahead and translate that first part?
El Estado en el 2017 hizo una llamada a los conceptos de importación de agua. Después el panel hizo otro en el 2021, pero no podíamos dar el criterio de fallas fatales antes de eso porque las fallas fatales se crearon después de que se hizo la llamada en el 2021.
And then when the panel had finished its first review of all these submissions, it emailed everyone who had made a submission and told them, here are the fatal flaws that you didn't pass, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to correct those. And it didn't occur to the panel or to any of us that it's possible that in correcting one fatal flaw, it might cause another fatal flaw. And I think one of the submitters emailed us and said, well, what are the rest of the fatal flaws? And when that's when we realized that we should share all of them. And so we did.
La razón por cual el panel volvió a abrir a que los equipos metieran sus materiales adicionales era porque no sabían sobre el criterio, así que esto daría una oportunidad de que resolvieran sus fallas fatales y no les ocurrió al panel compartir toda la lista del criterio hasta ya después que nos preguntó uno de los equipos que la compartiéramos para así ellos prevenir de hacer otra falla en resolver la falla que actualmente tenían.
And in terms, the last question is why only 2 weeks to respond? And we went back and forth 2 weeks, 3 weeks. What's an appropriate amount of time to respond? And settled on 2 weeks. And the reasons were that the panel itself has a very hard deadline to meet in its work and really needs to get on to the feasibility analysis and the summary report. And the other reason was that the panel felt that 2 weeks would be a sufficient amount of time for the level of detail it hoped to get and that could help it evaluate whether a fatal flaw was passed.
La razón por cual se dieron 2 semanas para que entregaran sus materiales adicionales era porque el panel pensaba que eso era justo y era también para no dilatar más el horario del panel.
All right. So
Brent-
Jasmine Phillips.
Brent, the final question was able to issues. Are we not able to please additional information?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. It's like your question is like my shopping list. If it's more than 3 things, I forget what's on it. And so within the process of the panel making recommendations to the state, there isn't an opportunity to revise and resubmit. And so the opportunity to participate or to have a concept that isn't moving forward re-enter isn't there.
No se puede dar otra vez la oportunidad de entregar materiales para solucionar sus fallas fatales porque no simplemente no está en el contrato y no se puede volver a hacer.
So Jasmine Phillips, please.
Thank you. My name is Jasmine Phillips. My comment contains multiple questions, so bear with me. In the fatal flaw report, under the heading Next Steps, please provide the names of and concept details of the importation concepts that were not submitted but came to the attention of the panel. Are these submissions subject to the same evaluation and criteria? And if not, why not? And how is this a fair and equitable evaluation process? I would also like to know the names of the individuals working for Tetra Tech who updated the Salton Sea accounting model and ran the hydrology and salinity analysis for the independent review panel. I'm happy to repeat any questions and thank you for this opportunity to comment.
Jasmine está dando preguntas en detalle sobre cómo fue el proceso de evaluación de los conceptos y también está pidiendo contactos de los consultantes Tetra Tech.
Well, thank you for those questions, Jasmine. And the question is, what are the importation concepts that have come to the panel's attention through other means? That's, I think, the first question. And that part of the fatal flaw report is addressing the possibility that the panel will generate its own approach. And as we've said at other times, if the panel does this, it will give credit to whoever whosever idea it was. For example, if it's a composite or related to what other people have already submitted. And in terms of importation concepts that come to the attention of the panel in other ways, I guess the panel chose that language to say that if there's a good idea out there that didn't come to the panel from the submissions, then it would be a service to the state to take it into account. And so that's why that term is there, and nothing like that would go forward without the same level of fatal flaw analysis and then possible feasibility analysis.
Profesor Brown está nomás clarificando que si llega a haber un concepto al final, ese pasará por la misma evaluación que los previos conceptos pasaron. Y luego está clarificando que cuando él dijo que los conceptos que no pasaron porciones de ellos serían integrados en un plan, eso sería decidido por el Estado al final, si eso pasaría o no.
And then there's another question, and it involves it has to do with a consulting firm called Tetra that is working with the state, and the panel used a spreadsheet model called SSAM, Salton Sea Accounting Model, to do analyses of salinity and lake level, depending on what the different submissions said. And this model began with the Bureau of Reclamation, and then Tetra Tech adapted it to the Salton Sea region, I believe, and then turned it over to the panel, and the panel did its own analysis. The panel's support team did the analysis, not Tetra Tech.
Oh, that's super dirty.
El profesor Haddad acaba de decir que Tetra Tech se usó el modelo de ellos pero originalmente era creado por el Bureau de Reclamación del gobierno federal y es sumamente lo que es usado para hacer modelos de agua en la región y por eso se procedió usando ese modelo.
All right, Bruce Greenberg, please.
Good evening. In setting the proposed routes, what steps were taken by the participants to understand right-of-way, possessionary rights, legal use rights from the property owners, the tenants, the ejidos, the Indian Nation, and respective government entities? The same question exists for the border crossing.
El individuo Bruce Greenberg está preguntando cuáles fueron los derechos que fueron discutidos entre las tribus y otras identidades que tienen derechos a tierra.
So some of the submissions went into great detail on those questions and talked about the route and who owned the land where the routes were proposed, and even gone to advanced effort to seek permissions for passage, and others less so. Others said, here's the route. So there was a wide range. And in terms of what it meant for the fatal flaw analysis, is if the panel felt that it was reasonably possible that that rights of way and property rights and so forth could be acquired, then that was enough, because it was a fatal flaw analysis, not a it wasn't a this is a good idea analysis. It was this is the minimum that is
Maybe if I
seems
unmute.
acceptable. So yeah, so that's how the panel considered that.
All right, thank you. So a lot more work and to accomplish the feasibility study.
A lot more work.
Bruce, la respuesta para Bruce era de que muchos grupos que hicieron un concepto estaban diciendo rutas con letras de apoyo, de que les dieron derechos a ciertos territorios y muchos era diferente al otro. Pero simplemente eso no fue incluido en las fallas fatales porque el panel decidió que no más las fallas fatales serían lo mínimo y no como más alto en dificultad.
Why I mentioned it, I actually authored the international valuation standards for appraising for the Mexican government. That's why.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's turn to Jonathan Horwitz.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Horwitz with the Desert Sun newspaper here in the Coachella Valley, and thank you so much for your informative report and taking the time tonight to answer our questions. I have a two-parter for you, and the first part of that is the report says that plans with fatal flaws have some compelling elements that you might want to include in your summary report. And I'm wondering if at this time you can talk more about what some of those elements are. And the second part of that question is that if the feasibility report is going to consider estimated costs for these three projects that have advanced, will there be any sort of discussion later on about how those costs might change if other recommended elements are added to them later on?
Jonathan,
could I just get a quick clarification?
Yeah.
By what do you mean by other recommended elements?
Yes, I mean, if there were parts of other plans that didn't.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Have fatal flaws, but you would like to advise the state to adopt some of those plans. If those elements are adopted in any one particular plan, how that could change the cost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan está con el periódico de la región y está preguntando dos preguntas. Una parte sería de las fallas fatales, ¿cuáles de los planes serán incluidos en el reporte resumido de esos que no pasaron las fallas fatales? Y la parte dos era que si habrá estimaciones en el precio de los conceptos que sí pasaron las fallas fatales.
So, as we've seen, these are very large and complex ideas that have been submitted. But if one aspect of it is fatally flawed, then as an entire project, the panel considers it to be fatally flawed. However, there are parts that could make sense as part of a there are good ideas in there, I guess is the way to put it, and the panel realized that. So the panel is still looking at that and thinking about what, and has not made any decisions yet on what its well, both if and what a panel's approach would be. But the panel wants to keep open the possibility of using all those ideas if they make sense. So what And so that's why that wording is in there, that it's possible that the panel will draw on those ideas. And if it does, of course, it will give full credit to whoever generated the idea. And then in terms of, will it be accounted for in costs? What will happen is the three passing submissions will be considered on their own. But if there's a panel approach, it will also be considered separately. So they won't be considered cumulatively.
Thank you.
El profesor Haddad contestó que hay buenas ideas en los proyectos que no pasaron las fallas fatales y tal vez unas sí llegarán al reporte resumido, pero no hay ni una decisión hecha. Por lo tanto, el panel nomás quiere reconocer que aunque no pasaron las fallas fatales, esos conceptos tienen buenas ideas. Y luego para la segunda pregunta, sí habrá estimaciones en el costo, pero no serán estimados cumulativamente.
Art Gertz.
Evening, Art Gertz, Vice Mayor West Shore. Thank you for having me. I ask if anyone on this committee a most basic question. Seemingly only non-government entities are required to perform fatal flaw analysis, and all government ideas and projects and actions, and perhaps Tetra Tech, are not scrutinized by fatal flaw analysis. So please answer this: why is only private entities, non-government entities, subject to the demands of the state, who drop these fatal flaw analysis very late in the game? And in the real world, you gave the seawater import presenters about 10 days to respond. And so my question is, why is that? Why is there not the same scrutiny for government entities and Tetra Tech that there is for non-government entities? Why is that?
Art Gertz parece que dijo que era el vicemayordomo del West Shores. Dice que por qué los grupos privados tenían que ser evaluados tan rudamente, pero ¿por qué será que al Estado no se le hace esos tipos de justificaciones?
Well, thank you, Art, for that question. And I can only answer for our project, unless you want me to put my professor hat on and get philosophical. And that is that for this project, the panel felt, and the state felt as well, that if there were concepts that had serious problems with them, like the threat of flooding the entire basin, that they should not be pursued. And the most efficient way to do that is to subject all of the proposals to a fatal flaw analysis. So that's how we set up this project and what the panel did.
El profesor Haddad está diciendo que no más podemos contestar preguntas sobre solamente el proyecto. Lo único que puede decir al derecho era que la manera más fácil de evaluar esos proyectos era poniéndolos en un análisis de fallas fatales.
So, Rich Coles, please.
Yes, good evening, everyone. A couple of things I would like to talk about fatal flaw. I've been an engineer for 40 years, worked on major programs from China to Dubai. And fatal flaw analysis is inherent to the conceptual design, not necessarily something that's superimposed by any entity. So when we took a hard look at this, we looked at the scientific data, the environmental data, the political realities, the alignments. If we want, I've moved alignments more than once, we do that again. Then we developed a basis of design. that basis was then, we set up a committee to evaluate, are there fatal flaws? And those fatal flaws then in turn roll into the conceptual design. And I do believe that the state has some legitimate comments about flooding the basin. I think the thermoclines, anticlines, and pycnoclines that exist with respect to intakes in the Sea of Cortez, and certainly discharge points, how it affects the hypolynium, are critical to this project. And some of the comments that Brent has presented here are spot on. Now, should other ideas be incorporated in the final design? You bet. We want the best, the brightest, and certainly the ultimate goal is to provide a viable, economically, ecologically sound project. And I think these elements are conducive to doing that. Thanks.
Rich Coles dio su apoyo a que los conceptos que no pasaron las fases fatales sean considerados también en el reporte resumido.
Well, thank you very much, Rich, for your comments. And just to expand on that, the next step is a more detailed feasibility analysis, which will get into those details. But even the feasibility analysis itself is not a final design. It's simply to help the state make decisions about what to pursue in far more detail.
Profesor Haddad clarifica que el siguiente paso es el análisis de factibilidad, pero aún ese análisis no incorporará aspectos del diseño, pero serán solamente recomendaciones para el Estado.
All right, Gary Jennings.
I believe you're on mute, Gary.
My apologies. I have 3 questions, and I'll just ask them one at a time. They're brief. It's my understanding that one of the successful companies is going through the Laguna Solada. That's correct?
Go ahead, I was just saying.
Está preguntando que si una de las compañías que pasaron va atravesado de la Laguna Salada.
That is incorrect. It looks like it on our map, and I can even, let me just
It's
go
okay.
back.
That's why I asked it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, please. All right, so your next question?
Why did you exclude the Laguna Solada? Because it is outside all of the boundaries of those reserves you listed. What is your issue with the Laguna Solada?
El profesor Haddad había contestado que es incorrecto, que no pasa ni un concepto sobre la Laguna Salada, y Gary está preguntando que por qué se está prohibiendo pasar sobre la Laguna Salada si está fuera de las áreas protegidas.
I think it is part of the Ramsar wetlands, and so that's why it was excluded as a location for infrastructure.
Fair enough, but if we show you that it's not, will that be removed as a fatal flaw?
Go ahead, I was just saying.
El profesor dice que fue excluido construir en Laguna Salada porque está protegido con las áreas humedades. Gary pregunta que si les demuestra que no está protegido, que cómo cambiarán.
So this is something that I would have to consult the panel on, but my sense is that if the panel has made any mistake in its analyses, it would certainly want to know and correct them.
So with respect to the panel and the distinguished people on this call, I respectfully challenge some of your statements because we spent, a decade down there. And we know that your statements about these biospheres and all these other reserves are just factually incorrect. So I don't say it to be cruel or rude, but I just say you've made a mistake. Then my last question is an easy one. What is your issue with industrial groundwater pumping a seawater? What's your issue with groundwater wells that are pumping 30 TDS seawater?
Go ahead.
Kelly está diciendo que les va a decir al panel respectualmente que revisen sobre la biosfera y el profesor Haddad dijo que harán revisiones y él está preguntando que qué hay con el problema de agarrar agua de pozo y llevarla al Salton Sea.
So I may be off in my answer because I'm trying to remember what the report said about that, but what I believe the panel found was that the scope or scale of a well field that was proposed. Now, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but there was a large well field proposed that was so large that the panel felt that it would not be able to sustain the draw of brackish water that was proposed. And so I think that's, I don't know if that was your proposal, but I remember that being something that the panel discussed.
Okay, and then, all right, thank you for your comment. We'll circle back in a letter, but I do want to touch on something that Rich Cole said.
Sure, you have some time
Just
left.
my comment is, there's a lot more to this than you guys may have realized. When you try to go through the central Mexicali Valley and cross well over 1,000 private parcels of land, you will find quickly that is a not buildable project. Engineering wise, of course, Rich knows what he's talking about from an engineering perspective. But I've lived in Mexico, and I just warn you, when you try to cross 80 miles of land that somebody's farming, you will never get an easement across 1,000 parcels of land. And I think this was a serious judgment error on the panel's part, because we know you didn't go down there and walk this stuff. And it is an error that will kill your entire strategy. You will never get 1,000 Mexicans to do business with Americans. Ask the beer company how that went for them. And thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. And Azucena?
El profesor Haddad había explicado que extracción de pozo, agua de pozo para el Salton Sea no era problema, el problema era la cantidad en que iba a ser extraída. Y luego Gary hace una advertencia al panel de hacer infraestructura en Mexicali, no piensa que sería posible. Y da sus comentarios.
So thank you. And your Gary, your concerns are noted and well taken. Let me just note that, in fact, the panel did walk the routes of these proposals. Obviously not all 80 miles of them, but the panel took an extensive field trip all the way down to the Sea of Cortez and stopped at every major infrastructure site proposed. And so they did their best to understand the conditions in Mexico as well as in the Salton Sea.
Thank you for your time.
Do you want to translate that, Azucena?
Profesor Brand había dicho que el panel sí había, de hecho, ido a México y ha ido a todos los lugares que fueron propuestos como lugares de infraestructura en uno de los planes. Nada más quería afirmar que el panel hizo todo lo que pudo para reconocer el área, aunque porque lo están evaluando.
All right. Let's go with Nicola Lockett.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Sure can.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to say a few words. I'm Nikola Lakic, graduate engineer architect, and one of proposal is my proposal. A very possible panel overlook it because my proposal is only proposal since 2018 that import water from San Felipe. That's reason just to avoid buffer zone. And even in this response to the panel recently, 3 weeks ago, I said I have several options. I'm putting pipelines straight through the buffer zone. That's not invasive act that could be nicely done to overpass line between there is a 15-degree from San Felipe to other side to avoid a buffer zone. Why is not used? Secondly, well, you consult with Tetra Tech and Salton Sea Authority. I can see that language. I'm in dispute with them because they're pushing for getting rid of lake. There was always against importing seawater, and there will be obstacle again and again by them. So now talking about smaller lake and continue with the dust suppression project, it does not make sense, people. If you're going to import water, all these projects, dust suppression related to dust suppression, are nonsense. It doesn't make sense. Why you would keep smaller lake and have option to import seawater? So that's one thing. Secondly, my response to the panel 3 weeks ago was substantial, 22 pages. I explain a lot of there. So, by the way, this open case for the court, if it's intentionally excluded because of some opposition, Tetra Tech and company that's working just the opposite of the saving Salton Sea and restoring Salton Sea, then open case for the court. I'm sorry to say that, but I hope that panel will review that a little bit truthfully and come back to the right track. By the way, my proposal generate about $500 million revenue just from energy. I know you was looking just importing seawater. It's much, much more than importing seawater. If you just import seawater, you still have pollution. You still have New River and Alamo River contaminated with pesticides and fertilizers.
2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And Azucena, if you would please translate it.
Nicola fue uno de los individuos que sometió un concepto para el panel y simplemente le está preguntando clarificación al profesor Haddad sobre cómo fue evaluado su concepto y está preguntando que hizo una ruta fuera de la área protegida y está preguntando detalles de cómo fue evaluada y clarificaciones en cómo fueron evaluados sus materiales adicionales.
So before I answer, let me mention we're at time. It's 7 p.m. But what I'd like to do is still take all the questions of people who already have their hand up. And so we'll go, if it's all right with everyone, we'll go a little bit late. And the last person we'll hear from is Carrie Morrison. So if that's all right, I suggest we go a little bit longer.
However, we can record all the questions that are in the chat, and please directly message me your name and email if you have a question in the chat that has been left unanswered so we can get back to you.
Do you want to translate that, Azucena?
El profesor Haddad está diciendo que estamos al horario de 7 y es cuando la junta se terminaba. Vamos a seguir las preguntas hasta el individuo Carrie Morrison y después de eso yo dije que si todavía tienen preguntas que no fueron contestadas, por favor, métalas al chat y también mándenme directamente en el mensaje su nombre y su correo electrónico para que le podamos contestar para atrás.
And that, yes, we will give you a chance. So yes, please stick around and we'll hear your question or comment. So The most important thing that I can address in Nicola, in your comments has to do with the relationship between the panel and Tetra Tech. So Tetra Tech is a consulting firm that is working with the state on its, I guess you would call it in-sea solutions, or in any event, Tetra Tech is working with the state on Salton Sea issues. And the independent review panel is operating independently from Tetra Tech. And the only connection that we've had with Tetra Tech has been in asking them for their version of the SSAM model, which we then used for our analyses. So I think that we may have had a training session where Tetra Tech said, here's how you use it. But that is the extent of the relationship. The rest of the analysis has been done by the panel and its support team. And the support team has included professors and graduate students from UC Santa Cruz, as well as the water engineering consulting firm Kennedy Jenks, and some of Kennedy Jenks sub-consultants. So there has been a separation between the state and this project, and we've really gone out of our way to maintain that wall so that the panel is seen as independent. And Azucena, will you please translate that?
Profesor Hadar nomás le aseguró a Nicola de que habrá una independencia entre el panel y el Estado, que no hubo, todas estas decisiones fueron hechas independientemente. Sí se consultó a Tetra Tech nomás para saber instrucciones de cómo usar el modelo, pero no se consultó Tetra Tech para detalles de cómo evaluar conceptos.
So thank you, Nicola. We're going to, interest of time, move to the next person, which is Luis Lopez.
Hi, yes, I'll keep it short and sweet. So overall, just how are we so sure that Mexico will allow the importation of water from the Sea of Cortez? You know, surely they're gonna want something in return, right? So has the panel taken into consideration what asks the Mexican government may have?
Luis pregunta que si ha mirado el panel en qué beneficio tiene México para extraer agua para importar a Salton Sea.
So, Luis, it's an excellent question. And in terms of this stage of the analysis, the panel is looking for fatal flaws. And it felt that there is at least a chance that a Sea of Cortez to Salton Sea project could get Mexican approvals and permits. And that's all it took to pass a fatal flaw analysis. We haven't gotten to, is it a good idea or is it a great idea? And that's our next step, is a feasibility analysis. And so that's where we will go into more detail on a very serious and important question like the one you just asked.
Profesor Hadar responde de que su pregunta será contestada en más detalle en el siguiente reporte, y simplemente lo único que cabe pasar eran las fallas fatales. No fue incluida los beneficios de México allí, pero sí serán discutidos más en los reportes que están por venir.
Okay, Annette Morales. Annette, are you still there?
Do it. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone.
We hear you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm Annette Morales-Rowe from Online Land Planning. As one of the firms with a proposal which passed all the science and all the criteria, yet did not pass fatal flaw item 5, I'd like to make a few comments for the record. The one fatal flaw question we were asked to respond was on the reliability of the water sources being available through 2078. There was no mention of state and coastal California permitting of reuse of recycled water, or our firm would have addressed that. Without question, criteria established for fatal flaw item 5 is purely speculative and subjective. Water availability flaws can be applied to all the proposals, including the Sea of Cortez and Mexico proposals, many times over for a variety of international, political, and social reasons. It's convenient for the panel to line up 3 similar schemes and compare them apples to apples. The cost, EIRs, and moreover, California state and foreign politics will inevitably kill these in the end, as it has done throughout the past. Otherwise, the state would have implemented these approaches already. It would make sense to have a US-based proposal as outliers and plan B, if you will, to give you a way out, especially for those proposals which pass all the technical and scientific criteria. We know your report is complete and submitted, yet we will look to the CNRA to make a sound judgment call on those proposals which passed all the science and criteria outside of fatal flaw item 5, which is not based on any empirical facts. Thank you.
La señora N. Morales era una de los participantes recipientes que metieron un concepto para el panel de importación de agua. Anotó que no pasó criterio número 5 y está dando sus comentarios sobre cómo fue evaluado su concepto y cómo no se fue mencionado el reuso de agua reciclada.
So thank you so much for those comments, Annette. And I think that you represent R13 perhaps. And if that's true, I may be, if that's not true, that what I'm about to say is incorrect, but
No, it's not R13, Brett.
Oh, it's not. Is hers the one that
it's
was
online line planning?
Okay, I'd have to.
R14, Brett.
Oh, okay. Is that one that deals with reclaimed water?
Correct.
Okay, and was that one that asked for anonymity?
No.
Okay, yeah, all right, I'm sorry. Let me just say that it is a valid fatal flaw that to expect that a project have provide benefits through 2078, and the panel came to that decision, and the panel thinks that's defensible. And in terms of R14, your specific submission, the panel discussed it at length, and it turns out that there is a great deal of expertise on the panel and on the support team related to Southern California water reclamation and reuse. And this is one of those moments where an expert panel arrived at an opinion. And so it's whether or not it's scientific, it's still a valid fatal flaw, and the panel made its decision and is ready to defend it. So, but thank you for your comments. Azucena?
El profesor Haddad acaba de clarificar que el panel escogió criterio número 5 porque piensa que es justificable y defensible en respetos con el uso de agua reciclable en California. Eso fue decidido como opinión del panel, la opinión experta del panel, y es por esa la razón la cual está ese criterio en esa forma. Pero quiere decir gracias por sus comentarios y su tiempo.
So let's turn to Mintachi Odeyapan.
Hi, good evening. This is Minachi, and I have a few questions, so feel free to stop me if you need me to.
Okay.
Has the panel considered any proposals that could turn a profit? And if so, would one of those proposals be a geothermal powered desalination? Because currently the region has a huge water shortage, as you might know, and a desalination plant would help with the Salton Sea mitigation problem and also with the current water shortage problem going through the region. And if a geothermal desalination plant is to be considered, can this be added to a proposal in the future?
Minachi está preguntando que si el panel ha considerado una planta desalinadora que sea energizada por una planta geotermal. Está preguntando que si el panel lo ha considerado o que si lo podrá considerar en el futuro.
So the panel looked at making cost a fatal flaw and decided that it would not. It would not consider cost or profitability in terms of creating a fatal flaw. And so any concept, regardless of cost, was it just wasn't considered. And so it didn't stop any idea from going forward. But the next phase of the project, which has to do with feasibility analysis, is definitely looking at costs and benefits. And so we'll have a better sense then of profitability. And the other thing is the panel is not choosing a final project. It's making a recommendation. And it seems that if an add-on to any idea is a good idea and even possibly profitable, that would be something that it wouldn't be part of this panel's process to recommend that or say, oh, you should do this, except for if the panel presents a composite idea. But there's, I would say, just more broadly in other ways besides the panel process, it seems that good ideas should be recognized.
El profesor Haddad está clarificando que el panel no evaluó las fallas fatales basados en lo que cuesta un proyecto o los beneficios del proyecto, simplemente en las 5 fallas fatales, y no considera que la cuesta de un proyecto como si fuera una falla fatal, y por eso es que no ha sido considerado un proyecto de esa manera.
So Rob Simpson, please.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. I have a question really for the panel in general. Current conditions within the Northern Gulf of California regarding sea level rise, temperature rise, and tidal energy. Since the 2010 earthquake that lowered 80,000 acre-feet of 80,000 acres of essentially the Delta by as much as 5.5 feet, have induced far greater tidal inundation in the area. This has induced along the Baja Peninsula accumulation of about 3 inches of salt crust along the entire Baja Peninsula. And north, we were just at Campo Ramona about 3 weeks ago, and noticed that number one, yes, the soil was very spongy and was accumulating a salt crust. This is due to the well-known process of salt inundation into aquifers and or other such processes. The aquifer at this depth is at least 2,500 meters. The question that I have is, does anyone on the council have a plan or possibility to reduce saltwater penetration into every aspect in Laguna Solada, in the river valley of Mexicali, and all of its wells? Because this is the number one concern in Mexico. This is what all of the politicians in Mexicali, Baja California, and everyone else is concerned with. Number one, do you or anyone on your panel even understand the process by which non-flooded areas of the floodplain accumulate salt crust on the top of them? Can you define or describe that process? If you cannot define or describe that process, you just don't have a clue as to what to do. So I asked that question, can you define or describe that process?
Thank you. Azucena.
Rob Simpson está preguntando al panel que si puede, dio muchos hechos de factibilidad de la acumulación de sal en cuerpos de agua, y está preguntando que si el panel puede describir el proceso en cual se acumula la sal debido a la penetración de agua salada.
So thank you very much for that description and your question. And for purposes of the fatal flaw analysis, the panel set a standard of not harming the biosphere reserve and Ramsar wetlands, and that was the minimum standard for passing that particular fatal flaw. But what you're describing is something that has to do with broader impacts that were not considered a fatal flaw, but part of what would be a good project. In other words, what makes sense, and that's really what's coming in the next two reports, is feasibility analyses, and then finally a summary report. But in terms of the expertise on the panel, well, I haven't had an opportunity to do a poll on whether or not we have that expertise, but I suspect the answer is yes, because we have an internationally known ecologist and an internationally known biogeochemist on our panel. And so I would expect that we have the ability to evaluate salt accumulation and impacts on aquifers.
So at this time, you cannot provide an adequate explanation as to how the massive ongoing ecological disaster that is reduced over the last 10 years, 90% of the brackish water dependent plants within the biosphere itself and zone 3 of the Ramsar Accord. You cannot describe.
Rob, thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much for your comment and your concern for the ecosystem in Mexico. And let me just say that the panel shares your concern for the Mexican
you share the concern,
ecology.
but you don't understand.
So thanks very much. Let's turn now to Jason McBride.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sure can.
Awesome. I have two questions, and I think this should be pretty quick. But before that, I'd like to make one note for the record.
Sure.
And this isn't to the panel. This is just the public. I'd like to note that the implication of the fatal flaw that the panel assigned to us implies that it is a more favorable environment to get a binational agreement with Mexico than a state level agreement in California. And you can correct me if you believe otherwise, but I think that's an indictment of our regulatory structure.
That's a correct observation.
Okay.
But we should translate that. But so go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry that it sort of cut off when Jason was speaking on my end.
I can restate it.
Yeah.
I can restate it. I'd like to note that the implication of our fatal flaw, we propose a tunnel intake and brine return to the Pacific Ocean. I'd like to make the point that the implication of our fatal flaw is that the panel believes it is more favorable and more likely to get a binational water agreement with Mexico than it is to resolve this internally with our regulatory structure in California.
Jason McBride él fue uno de los líderes que dio un concepto al panel y él está nomás dando dando su opinión de que el panel excluyó su concepto como una falla fatal debido a que piensa que no será aprobado su proyecto de túneles en el Pacífico con las reglas y las leyes regulatorias que tiene el estado de los Estados Unidos a comparación de que a lo mejor México sí podrá permitir un proyecto de esa manera.
And then,
go ahead.
Then if I may, I had two questions. One is that, we believe that based on your feedback, we think that our fatal flaws may be resolvable with some fixable configurations. We'd like to know, and I understand that you will continue with the feasibility study, but would we be able to submit material to the panel and get feedback or review just to see if we could, if not evaluated for feasibility, we'd like to at least get to a point where we could demonstrate to the people of California the technical feasibility, should regulatory regimes change. I think given the 2-week window, we'd like to add a few tweaks that we think would resolve the concerns raised. And we'd like to know, if not part of the major publish, if as part of this overall project, we could work with you guys to maybe get a few extra tweaks on it or some feedback to see, could we offer the people of California something, if not officially, right? Just to demonstrate perhaps that we could get to technical feasibility with maybe 1 or 2 more iterations.
Jason está preguntando que si podría el panel aceptar revisiones adicionales a su concepto para que también beneficie y miren los residentes de California cómo beneficiaría su proyecto.
First, to comment on the observation of the regulatory possibility of getting permits to move water from the California coast to the Salton Sea versus Sea of Cortez to the Salton Sea. While I would say that observation is consistent with what the panel found, I'll just give the slight caveat that it's not exactly apples to apples, because what was being proposed for California to Salton Sea was different in engineering than what was being proposed from Sea of Cortez. It's a pipeline versus tunnel, but nevertheless, the point is well taken. And then in terms of moving ahead and thinking about the technologies that were presented, and the panel has talked about how there are a lot of good ideas and a lot of technologies that really deserve further investigation and investment and opportunities to prove themselves. And yet at the same time, the way the panel has been, the panel's agenda and its requirements are set up, the panel's not in a position to do that. and so I wouldn't be surprised if the panel, and I think in fact in the Fatal Flaw report, the panel does recommend that there be investments in emerging technologies and ideas that emerged from this process. And so, so while it's not part of what the panel has the capacity to do itself, it supports what you're suggesting and it sees the validity in what you're suggesting.
Okay, I appreciate that. And one last one, super quick, if I may.
Mhm.
Is there any enforcement mechanism besides the honor system to ensure that whoever wins, the state works with them to implement the solution rather than just picking some other preferred vendor or provider? In other words, we're all developing exceptional IP, including the panel. I presume if you create your own combination of the ideas, what next for the state with a project like this to ensure that the state honors the people who contributed all the time and effort and energy to develop these proposals so that they get, some connection to that final thing besides just a footnote to say, hey, we came up with the idea?
Understood. And this is asking a whole lot of Azucena this late in the evening, but do you think you could translate both what my prior answer was as well as Jason's question?
Yeah, I had a note here. But el profesor Haddad había respondido a la previa pregunta de Jason de que aunque el panel sí excluyó su concepto basado en la falla fatal de que no podría permitir extracción del Pacífico del estado de California, sí está diciendo que su concepto tenía buenas ideas, pero el panel no podrá extender otra revisión para que puedan asumir más materiales adicionales para responder a esta segunda revisión de sus fallas fatales. Ahora Jason pregunta al profesor Haddad una pregunta sobre el contrato, que si puede saber cómo el Estado haría los contratos con contratistas en cualquier proyecto que será seleccionado.
So I'm afraid my answer is I don't know. And the panel doesn't know because we've never gotten guidance from the state on what it means for the submitters of these ideas in terms of a claim on their ideas. And so if I were to speculate, it would be just one person guessing. But the question is a valid one. What is the relationship of the submitters to whatever the state ultimately decides to do if it's based on their submissions? And I would say as PI for this panel project, I don't know, and the panel's yeah, so sorry, I guess that's all I can say about that.
If I may, then I'd like to just make a point to the state for the record that I'm from Silicon Valley. Why do we have all this innovation? It's because we created the idea of stock grants for employees, which rewarded employees and people in the ecosystem for generating ideas. And because they could profit from those ideas, they created those ideas, and that created this ecosystem. And I think we're pioneering a lot here. And I'd like to make the point to the state that while it wasn't part of the original requests, it would behoove them to find a way to reward people for all the time and energy and effort so that they could generate in the future more ideas like this to other problems that seem intractable, but have plenty of goodwill people like us who would love to make a contribution and see it through. So I think that would be just something I'd like to make as a point to the public.
And let me, go ahead, Azucena.
El profesor Haddad simplemente no tenía una respuesta para su pregunta de cómo el Estado haría las contrataciones con los proyectos elegidos. Simplemente no tiene una respuesta para eso.
And let me just point out that in the chat, James Newcomb is one of the he works for the Department of Water Resources, and he's at a fairly high level, and he's responsible for Salton Sea activities. And he writes that the SSMP, the Salton Sea Management Program, will provide a response to this question. So thank you for raising it, Jason. And our last question is coming from Carrie Morrison.
Thank you so much. While we're on track, was James Newcomb going to respond here? It just seems like this is a good venue for it. If so, because 73 of us are still here, and he said he might be able to answer that. Is that an option? We've appreciated working with him. It's something that's pretty important to all of us, I think. If not, I can move into my question, but it seemed reasonable.
I guess you should move into your question and wait for James to issue a thorough response that he's run through. That's been run up and down the flagpole and is not coming at 7:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. So
fair enough. Thank you so much. My name is Carrie Morrison. I'm the founder of the Eco-Media Compass and a rather large social movement about the Salton Sea. For 12 years, we've acted as philanthropists and educators, sharing information for solutions at the Salton Sea. The reason I got involved in this is my mom passed away when I was 6 from a lung condition, and I wanted to help people not have to go through that. I kind of accidentally became mayor of the West Shores because I kept bringing people up to Sacramento and giving them a voice and educating them about the Salton Sea, and our team at the Eco-Media Compass has been incredible and are a big part of the reason that these proposals are on the table today. I want to reaffirm how important it is that adding water to the system in general is for the Southwest of the United States and Northern Mexico. Salton Sea independent, we need more water. And a lot of these projects here that are in discussion would ease strains off of the drought and create opportunities for life in the future of the Southwest. I'd like to encourage your team, if you do choose to, could be pulled into a composite importation project, Mr. Haddad, which I believe means your team haven't decided yet if you're going to take these ideas and put them into one, to work with these project proponents because they're brilliant and they've taken many, many years to put these together. We have some concern that some of these could be delivered to the state and then they would use one very preferred consulting firm that has also been drafting the criteria for non-water import projects, which in itself would be a conflict of interest. And if they have been acting as a monopoly for many, many years, that has been stifling innovation and could be hurting the future of life in the Salton Sea region. So I'd like to encourage your team, if you do decide to choose to provide recommendations and a composite project, to work with these teams and keep as many things alive as possible. Add water to the system. We looked at Owens Lake, third of the size of Salton Sea. The last time I was there, they had spent $4 billion, mostly in mitigation, very little alive, and a lot of that was pouring fresh water back into it so it wouldn't blow around again. We can do better at the Salton Sea. And I'd also like to say that one thing that I think is worthwhile doing is giving these teams a little bit more time, because you came with some criteria that were very relevant, but they were really rushed. And we would much rather you do a good job and take a little bit longer and ask for a little more time than do this entire process a half-assed response. We deserve better, and we believe you have the expertise to do a really good job, but if you need a little more time, ask for it. We'll have a better outcome. And there are a few different, I know it would be uncomfortable, but we're here, we're your witness, we're your team members. So I'd like to encourage that, and I'd like to encourage these teams that had one or two little fatal flaws, give them maybe a little bit more time and then work with them to collectively come to a better understanding instead of handing over just a report to the state to check off the box. You are leading the way for water sustainability and life sustainability for the Southwest of the United States and Northern Mexico, and we believe in you, and we need a little more time for you to do a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. This would be a very short summary of what you said, Carrie, on my translation. Just like, sorry.
And most tracks behind us are ours. We've traveled the entire route a number of times. We're friends with the landowners. Mexico will work with us if we have a good plan. California will work with us if we have a good plan. We've never developed something big enough to believe in. We need to believe that we're worth it. Thank you.
Okay. Carrie Morrison da sus comentarios sobre la revisión de conceptos que el panel ha estado hecho, dio comentarios sobre el proceso, el tiempo de la revisión y dio varios comentarios sobre cómo él siente que el proceso ha sido muy rápido y tal vez podría ser tomar más tiempo en volver a evaluar y volver a tener una discusión con los conceptos que hicieron un proyecto.
All right. So thanks all of you. We appreciate so much your taking the time to be with us this evening and for your excellent comments. And there's, well, we simply couldn't get to all of the questions that came in through the chat. And so, but we'll answer them. There are some really good ones, and we'll especially if you, we would be happy to email an answer to you, but we would need your email because we can't get it from, the chat. So if you want to follow up with us, please do.
Mr. Haddad,
so
would you like any
with
support
that,
from the Long Range Planning Committee members and some of us here to ask for any more time? We're happy to do it. I'm a member of that committee. Would more time help with a better outcome? We can help you if more time would help.
Thank you.
Not an embarrassment.
Okay, thank you. As you can see, it's July 20th, and we were hoping to have our fatal flaw report done a few weeks before this, but we decided it was more important to have an excellent report than to rush it. So we might take you up on that, and but thank you very much for that offer. So I was just saying, I guess I've been speaking a lot in English. Do you want to translate what this exchange and then?
Simplemente el profesor Haddad está concluyendo la junta y gracias por su tiempo y estamos ya pasados, mis disculpas por pasarnos del tiempo de la junta, pero está la junta está en conclusión.
All right, and with that, we will finish the evening. There are 66 people left in the room, and congratulations to all of you for taking it all the way to the conclusion. And have a wonderful evening, and we will check back in with you when we have a feasibility study to share with you. Thank you all again, and good night.
Muchas gracias a todos, pasen buenas noches y si tienen preguntas, por favor, envíalas a nuestro correo electrónico. Muchas gracias. Goodbye, everyone.